thank you all for joining us today and joining the Center for Applied Linguistics for this 30-minute webinar entitled Early Childhood Education Through the Lens of Digital Equity. This webinar is our latest installment of a year-long series entitled Research to Policy, Critical Conversations in Language Education, in which we assemble content area experts, researchers, and practitioners to have the timely and critical conversations about educating multilingual learners through this lens of digital equity. My name is Trey Calvin, and I serve as the Communications Director for the Center for Applied Linguistics. And today I'm joined by two esteemed experts who together account for over 60 years of experience at this intersection of research policy and practice in language education. Dr. Kathy Escamilla is a professor of education at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Division of Social, Bilingual, and Multicultural Foundations. Dr. Escamilla's research centers on educational issues related to Spanish-speaking language minority students in U.S. schools, and she's specifically interested in issues related to the development of bilingualism and biliteracy in early elementary grades. Her recent research examines assessment practices and the impact of high-stakes testing on these children. Kathy, it's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'd also like to introduce Annie Duguay. Annie is the Director of Language and Literacy at Cal, primarily working with pre-K through 12 programs that welcome and instruct multilingual learners. Annie coordinates and delivers professional development for educators working with language learners throughout the United States and abroad on topics ranging from content and language integrated learning, literacy development, and building welcoming schools. Prior to coming to Cal, she taught pre-K through 8 school as a ESL teacher and coordinator. Annie, as always, it's wonderful to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Trey. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We love to see your geographical location. So if you want to add to the chat box, feel free. So as Trey said, our topic today is digital equity and early childhood education. So first, I'd like to frame the conversation a little bit. Prior to the pandemic, this isn't a new topic, right, in terms of early childhood learning and what is that right amount and the balance of digital media, the resources that practitioners and parents can use. It will sound very familiar to those of us on the call who might recall the debate around amount of television time for young learners and children. In 2016, the American Academy of Pediatricians issued some recommendations around children's media. So I just wanted to recognize that from 2016 includes avoiding screen media entirely for children younger than 18 months, unless video chatting. I thought that was an interesting specification, as we know that's grown a lot during the pandemic, keeping multi-generations together. Generally limiting screen use to an hour a day of what they call high quality programs for children ages 2 to 5. And beyond that, designating media-free times, such as dinner or driving, and media-free locations, such as perhaps bedrooms. And so in addition, having ongoing communication around online citizenship and safety. So Trey has some links I know we can share at some point during our session with these recommendations in both English and Spanish as a resource for you. So as that was prior to the pandemic, already a conversation around the appropriateness of digital media for our young learners. And now we have a new reality as of the pandemic around remote learning. With any shift in policy, there was remote learning has its advantages and disadvantages. And so we'd like to examine this topic more thoroughly through the lens of digital equity. So Dr. Escamilla, thank you for being here today. Because of your work and research, you have a unique perspective on the challenges that parents, teachers, and students have been facing during this time. So I'd like to start by asking you if you could describe a few of the major barriers you have seen during the pandemic facing our youngest multilingual learners in particular.
Thank you, and good afternoon, at least this afternoon where I am. I hope that you're all doing well and surviving. Early childhood education, I want to start by saying, especially for multilingual learners, is one of my passions. My very first job after college was in Head Start. I was a Head Start teacher for 4-year-olds. And so it's near and dear to my heart. And so I, like many of you, have been very concerned about the potential impact of the pandemic on these very young children and their families. And as we know, they weren't given the same kind of priority as K-12 kids. To start the discussion, I want you to know that we're using in this next few minutes the very broad federal definition of early childhood, which is between the ages of birth to 5. I'm going to focus probably more narrowly on 3 and 4-year-olds, but every young child and every family we know was affected during the pandemic. With regard to 3 and 4-year-olds, it's important for us to know that they are growing multilingual learners much faster than the general population. Multilingual learners now account for 33% of all Head Start kids, and they're growing at double the rate of K-12 multilingual learners. So when we talk about digital equity or any kind of equity with regard to young children, it's important that we keep these very young people in our minds. So while there's no doubt that multilingual learners and their families have been negatively impacted by the pandemic in disproportionate numbers, I don't want to start the webinar from a deficit perspective. The families of our multilingual learners are both amazing and resilient. And I would say they're much more accustomed to overcoming obstacles that have been thrown at them than many of us. In many cases, they have survived adversity, food insecurity, racism, and linguicism. And as many of us know, they've been on the front lines during the pandemic, working to keep our communities safe. So I think, if anything, what has been revealed during this pandemic is the amazing partners or potential partners we have in these families. So that said, many of you, probably better than me, know that there were also significant barriers or challenges. For example, school districts raced to get Chromebooks and into homes and help teachers get online resources to develop lessons and learning in more than one language. But the same couldn't be said of our younger learners. Many of the young children were in homes with older siblings, and the older siblings needed to be learning online, and there weren't enough devices for the whole family to each have a device. As we know, in many of our cities, our poorest families didn't have access to any devices or to Wi-Fi or other tools to get online learning going if they had devices at all. The pandemic really revealed the depths of the digital divide. Even if parents had the devices and the connectivity, the lessons, and even if the lessons were in Spanish, the parents frequently did not know English, and the settings on the computer were in English. And so many times the parents didn't understand how to access the lessons for their kids. I discovered something really interesting during all of this, and that is that even though materials are in languages other than English, for example, Spanish, teachers' guides and directions to the adults teaching young kids are often only printed in English. So even if we shared how to do things with parents and said, do them in Spanish, the actual directions were in English. Many of teachers reported to me that the most difficult part was finding a platform that was easy to use and navigate. We know that the younger the child, the more the parent needed to help monitor and scaffold the learning. The younger the child, the less likely they were to be able to translate for their parents, as older kids could. Many of the learning lessons that are available in Spanish, like I said, had teachers' guides that were in English. So for parents who lost their jobs, many people also reported that online learning actually was an additional source of stress. So we have work to do. That's not to say that I'm sounding like a Debbie Downer. That's not what I meant to say. But I was asked to talk about the challenges. The challenges were formidable. And we need to consider the challenges as we formulate our post-pandemic responses.
Thank you, Kathy. You bring up a great point about the the positives that also emerged. I know a lot of families who have relatives abroad were already used to using WhatsApp or other tools to communicate with loved ones, and so there were, thinking about some of the drawbacks to remote learning, but also those silver linings. Are there any other advantages, and thinking about, now that many school districts are back to learning in person on that edge, I wonder if you could speak to how parents, students, and teachers might continue to reap the benefits of remote learning while avoiding some of those drawbacks.
I thank you for that. I mean, so the first question was, what were the challenges? But the second one, I think, is how do we understand the progress that we have made? So I want to say that I think we have spent way too much time talking about things like learning loss and the COVID slide, and we haven't spent enough time talking about the potential benefits. And one of the benefits is that many of our teachers spent hours and hours and hours getting devices to families and helping families use these. Families learned skills that they didn't have before the pandemic. We don't want to let this go. In fact, to the credit of many of our communities, there was an all-out effort to distribute devices to families and children. There were lots of efforts to help parents learn to help their children. In fact, I think in many ways the partnerships between parents and schools were strengthened during the pandemic, and many of our schools gained great respect for parents. It's not that they didn't respect parents before, but they really realized what great partners they were. Our schools, our teachers spent many hours developing lessons in English and other languages, and many hours were spent looking for online resources that were appropriate, that didn't just have kids sitting in front of a screen, that were appropriate for early childhood people. To the extent that families and online learning were available in non-English languages, this was also advantageous to our youngest learners. We know if anything, maybe children got more opportunities to use and maintain their first languages during the pandemic as people looked for resources that were in both languages, and maybe had an opportunity to develop bilingualism that might not have happened pre-pandemic. So we also know that the research has told us that 3- and 4-year-olds, especially in preschool programs, begin something called language loss early on in their experiences in formal schooling. And so one of the advantages may have been that they had more opportunities to maintain and use non-English languages in the home with the support of their parents. So I think also to our advantage is the fact that preschool standards were on our side, and especially in Head Start programs, because the K-12 curriculum, which is much more focused on academic development. And so for early childhood, we have the advantage of saying we're interested in language and the development of communication. We're interested in physical development and motor skills. We're interested in socio-emotional development and in the general cognition. And so we could now look to the online resources that we have identified and maybe be a little more discerning in which ones are really going to help us. The research is clear that all of these domains can be developed and enhanced in any language. And so even during the pandemic, we could encourage parents to do whatever they needed to do in all these domains. It's important to encourage parents to use the non-English language. I think there was a lot of hand-wringing about children losing the opportunity to learn English, but we rarely talk about the opportunity to become bilingual. And so in this situation, perhaps it was advantageous that children had opportunities to be in their homes with parents who were going to continue to develop their language and communication skills. And hopefully, again, focus on bilingualism. I think one of the big advantages moving forward is the potential for online learning and storytelling experiences And the fact that these storytelling experiences can be done online in different languages and in different cultural and ethnic groups. Just as we can engage kids in stories in schools, we certainly can engage them in online stories. We can encourage the online learning of songs and rhymes in English and other languages. And we found programs that actually pay attention to developing vocabulary and teaching oracy in 2 languages. In terms of avoiding the drawbacks of the past, this is the last thing I'm going to say. It's important that we do not promote online materials that are not interactive. We don't want kids just sitting in front of screens for hours and hours. I think during the pandemic, especially at the beginning, we were looking for something. We needed something and we needed it quickly. And I think post-pandemic, we can be much more discerning in what kind of materials we use. But now that we're returning to in-person, it's important that we don't totally give up our online opportunities.
Yeah, I think, this reinforced for me how our students and these early learners are what they call digital natives. So
Yeah.
even more so during this pandemic, the opportunities to use these tools, not just the aspect of receiving the information like from television, but also being interactive, engaging, hands-on, applying what they know, being able to click and sort or do activities online. And I think that, so much giving credit to the teachers as well for doing so much of their own training, whether that came from a district or school level or just initiatives and a lot of collaboration among teachers themselves to get the skills in Google Classroom and various platforms to be able to work with their students. So that capacity stays with us as we move back into the classroom. Another thought that comes up sometimes, I know in some of the school districts here in the United States, folks are not allowed, or the students can't share materials, or each have to have their own markers or other manipulatives. And so having that still digital interaction can continue in the classroom as well as a way to keep that social distancing when required, even though we want our students doing lots of interactive activities as well. So thinking about the policy elements, Dr. Escamilla, I wanted to ask you if you had a magic wand and you could make positive changes in the lives of young multilingual learners in this country, what would you use this magic wand to do? What current policy or new policy would you like to see implemented or modified for that purpose?
So I wish I could lay claim to being the creator, the originator of a lot of these ideas, but I'm going to repeat what a lot of other people said. Perhaps the pandemic has emphasized to us or has laid bare the need for us to create universal, publicly funded early childhood education with online learning embedded in tools and connectivities for all communities. I mean, now is the time for us to say, seriously, it doesn't do us any good if we allow parents to continue to work from home who have young children and then have nothing for young children to do except climb the walls or stare at a screen. So I do think it's time for us to talk about universal publicly funded early childhood education. I would like to see policies in all of our communities really reflect what we know about developing bilingualism. So I worry when immigrant parents maybe go to a pediatrician who says, well, it's important that they dominate one language. Well, at least they've reduced that, and they don't say the need to dominate one language is English only. But we need to make more of a focus, I think, on bilingualism and biliteracy and the potential for young children to become biliterate. So I would like to see early childhood included more in the federal policies about language that govern K-12 learners. I would like to see that extended to preschool also. I would like to see more of the intentionality of having kids have the opportunity to Zoom with their grandparents in other countries, or do the kinds of things of FaceTime as ways to bring the community into the school. And I would, like I said, I would like to see some changes to, some of the things that people assume about young children that aren't true in the research, that they're confused by learning two languages at once. I guess I would like to see K-12 be more like preschool, in that it broadens its range of what's important beyond the academic to the cognitive development and socio-emotional and physical development and motor skills. I think that there's some attention to that, particularly post-pandemic, but I think that we need to think of a broader and more comprehensive look at birth through college in our public policies. We need to keep chipping away at the digital divide, that's for sure. Oh, I need to say this, there in the chat, we have included potential resources for people who are working in early childhood centers.
Yeah, some great recommendations. And I've heard even from our own colleagues at the Center for Applied Linguistics who bring their multilingual children to the pediatrician's office to get those mixed messages where our colleagues defend multilingualism and kind of do a little bit of teaching to the pediatrician about the types of resources to offer and the research behind, the very clear research behind the benefits of bilingual and multilingualism for young learners and for parents and community. So I think that's a very important, emphasis on thinking around what we can do in education, what we can do with parents, but also kind of societally and with our medical community who often are the first connections that the parents and perhaps immigrants and refugees might have if there's young learners or young children, infants are brought into a American, in our case, institution. It would be often with a pediatrician even before school. So an important one. I know our time is getting a little bit low and there are some questions. So I think Trey was going to jump in and perhaps add in some questions.
Yes, I've been monitoring the question and answer box at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. If you are a participant on today's call and you'd like to ask us a question, please do so now. We usually finish within the 30-minute timeline, so we have about 7 minutes to answer your questions. And I'll start out with one that's pretty basic, and it's directed to you, Kathy. The way that you opened up the webinar was to describe what it means to be early childhood, and in that space particularly. And I wonder if you could talk about what digital equity means. Sort of, what is the definition, maybe a very broad definition of what it means to be equitable in the digital space?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's one that I think probably like I said, there are others online who may be better able to answer it than I am. But here's my definition. Okay, so somebody comes to my house and gives me a computer, goodie. Now what? So equity means not just do we have the devices, do we have the Wi-Fi, but do we have access to the learning that we need in order to make it productive for our children. And that, to me, I think was one of the biggest challenges. So as much as we tried to get devices into homes and get them connected, there were formidable challenges for teachers trying to teach parents how to use programs where the settings are all in English and the parents don't speak English. So we need better ways of doing translanguaging to help parents get on the tools. I would like to see more tools that really are like the few that we have on the chat that talk about how you use one language to develop another one. So this is a bilingual equity issue and not one of just having the tools and the machinery, so to speak, to do it. What does it really mean to engage? And, you know, and understanding that there are real realities in families where, you know, their older kids are going to school, there are, you know, parents who are working, and the younger the child, the more the need to monitor and be involved. And so what does equity mean? How do we figure out how to navigate that reality?
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned briefly translanguaging. For some people that are on the call that may not understand what this concept is and how it might tie into digital equity, I wonder if you might be able to explain just very briefly what this is.
Okay, so translanguaging is the use of two languages in service to some act of communication. And it's it used to be thought of as something that you didn't want to do. But now what we know is that it's really a pretty powerful tool. So as an example, we give a parent a computer, they don't speak English, and we are online. We're on a Zoom like this, and we're trying to explain to the parent how to use it. And so we have to say things like, donde dice settings, tienes que puchar este botón. And I use the word puchar, which is a Southwest language word. I use the word settings because that's what it says on the computer. So I'm not confused and I'm not mixing languages. I'm using two languages in the act of teaching parents how to use a computer, because you need both languages, because the computer's in English and the parents are speaking in Spanish or another language.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that, and there was such a succinct definition. I have to give you a lot of credit for that.
Oh, thank you.
And a great example. Annie, I'll pause. I do have another question, but I want to leave some space if you have any other questions or comments before I move on.
Oh, I was just in terms of the digital equity. I think the piece around the access and the training, but also the quality of the usage that brought me back to Dr. Escamilla earlier said, you know, there needs to be interaction around it, not just putting on a screen, putting on the video. So I think what we talked about earlier, when you would use a tool like a book, we encourage parents to ask questions, point out different pictures, stop and talk about the background. Oh, have you ever been to the beach? You know, all those aspects that parents and teachers are familiar with in terms of lifting from the page. We also want to do that with lifting from the screen, if you will.
Mm-hmm. The other question I have, we have about 3 minutes left. So if you do have a question, please enter it now. It comes from, I will find your name so that I can attribute it to you correctly in just a moment. I'm kind of having multiple screens up, as we all do. Would you say that teachers of emergent bilinguals have grown their relational capital with children and parents during the pandemic? And there's definitely some interpretation to be had with the question about relational capital. I might chisel that question down to more maybe for certain teachers and students, has the relationship been able to become better with more contact, and maybe for others not so much? What's your take on that, Dr. Escamilla?
Oh, so I don't think you can make a blanket statement about that. I think that for many of the teachers that I have talked to or worked with, there was a newfound respect for parents. And that does not mean that before the pandemic, they didn't respect parents, not at all. But there was a newfound respect for what parents were up against and how hard they were willing to try to make sure that their kids had access to school. And I think that was pretty profound for a lot of teachers. And again, I am not disparaging them. I do not think that before the pandemic, they didn't respect parents or they thought they weren't capable. But at times we do go to trainings where people will tell us, well, you know, the parents, they don't have a high level of formal education and they can't and they don't and they won't. And so we've learned deficit notions about families. And I think that some of those stereotypes were really challenged. And, teachers told me, gosh, I just can't believe it. This mother, all she's got is a cell phone, and she's managing to do everything that I tell her with this cell phone, and really has her child engaged. So I think that we did manage to create in the teachers who had the opportunities to do this work a newfound respect for what parents first of all, can do, and secondly, willing to do to try to help their children.
Thank you for that, Kathy. That's all the time that we have today. And I want to say thank you, a special thank you to Annie for hosting us today, and Dr. Escamilla for preparing such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yes,
all right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much. Join us in just a few weeks when we have our next Research to Policy webinar, and more details to come on that. Or you can visit our website at cal.org for more. Thank you so much. Y'all have a great rest of your week. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.